Lonely rancher found a native woman crying in the rain. Then he said, "You're safe." The rain came down like molten iron, hammering the earth until it steamed. In the heart of Sulphur Springs Valley, the sky split open with thunder, and the land itself seemed to tremble. Joss Carver leaned low in the saddle, hat brim dripping, rain slick in his calloused hands. He'd been chasing a lost steer when the storm found him instead. Through the curtain of rain, something caught his eye. A wagon toppled in the mud, one wheel shattered, a single lantern flickering weakly beside it. And then he saw her, a woman, bareheaded, kneeling beside a motionless body half buried in water, her dark braids heavy with rain, even from a distance. Joss could tell she wasn't white. Every instinct told him to ride on. Trouble came easy in this country, and he'd learned to stay clear of it. But when she lifted her face toward him, eyes wide and hollow as the desert night, he pulled the reins and muttered, "Damn it all." The storm had rolled in from the Chiricahua Mountains without warning, smothering the valley beneath a curtain of gray. The smell of wet iron hung in the air, the kind that rose from scorched earth when the first heavy drops hit. Between flashes of lightning, the land stretched wide and empty, broken only by yucca stalks bending in the wind and a crooked fence line swallowed by the flood. Sulphur Springs Valley, Arizona Territory, 1878. It was the kind of place that made and unmade men. Those who stayed learned quickly that mercy was a luxury the desert rarely returned. Joss Carver swung down from his horse, boots sinking in mud up to the ankle. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man built by ranch work rather than ambition. His shirt clung to him, rain running off the brim of his hat. Years of herding cattle beneath a pitiless sun had left his skin dark and his eyes narrow from squinting at the horizon too long. The scar along his jaw, pale against tan skin, told of a fight once won, or perhaps one barely survived. He moved toward the wagon cautiously, one hand brushing the revolver at his hip. The lantern's flame wavered, throwing a frail light over the wreck, a horse dead in its traces. A trunk burst open, its contents scattered in the mud strips of leather, blackened iron tools, and something that glinted like half-forged steel. Then she turned toward him. The woman couldn't have been more than 21. Her dress, once pale buckskin, clung to her frame, torn at the hem. Mud streaked her cheek, and blood had dried on her sleeve where she'd tried to lift the man beside her. Her hair, long and black as raven's wings, was braided with thin strands of turquoise beads that caught the lantern light. When she spoke, her voice was low but steady, shaped by an accent soft and deliberate. "They took the horses," she said, "and killed him when he tried to stop them." Joss looked down at the body, a man in his 40s, chest pierced by a single bullet. The hands were those of a craftsman, thick-fingered and scarred from the forge. Around his neck hung a strip of rawhide threaded with a small piece of iron shaped like a broken hook. "Your father?" Joss asked. She nodded, lips trembling but eyes dry. "They thought we carried silver. It was only iron." He studied her face, fine-boned, proud, and saw not helplessness, but a kind of fierce control. The same stubborn will that kept a man alive out here. He knew enough to recognize an Apache when he saw one. And he knew what people would say if they saw him standing here beside her. He should have ridden off, but he didn't. Joss untied a tarp from his saddle and knelt beside the body. "We'll bury him proper," he said quietly, "before the coyotes find him." Rain washed over his hat brim, over her shaking hands as she helped him dig. When they finished, Joss laid the broken iron hook atop the mound of wet earth. The woman whispered something in her language, soft, rhythmic, carried away by the wind. He straightened, mud clinging to his knees. "Name's Joss Carver," he said finally. She met his gaze. Nahona. Lightning split the sky above them, white and merciless. Around them stretched miles of flooded prairie and a road that led nowhere safe. Joss glanced once more at the grave, then at the woman who stood beside it, hair whipping in the wind like a banner. He pulled the reins of his horse and said, "There's a line shack west of here. You'll catch your death if you stay." And without waiting for her answer, he reached down a calloused hand, the kind that rarely offered help, and she took it. They rode through the valley in silence, the storm fading into a low grumble beyond the mountains. The rain left behind a smell of mesquite smoke and wet earth, sharp enough to taste. The woman, Nahona, rode behind him, her small frame pressed against his back for balance. Joss could feel the tremor in her hands as she clung to the saddle horn. By the time they reached the ridge, the light had gone. The sky turned the color of iron, and a few lingering flashes still cracked across the horizon. Ahead, barely visible through sheets of mist, stood a line shack, a squat timber hut used by ranchers during cattle drives. Joss dismounted and helped her down, careful not to meet her eyes too long. "Stay close," he said. "Floor's dry inside. Stove still works if the wood ain't rotten." The door groaned open, releasing a smell of damp dust and old coffee. He struck a match and lit the oil lamp in the dim light. The place was bare: one cot, a table, a stove streaked with rust, a single shelf lined with tin cups, and an old Bible swollen from rain. Nahona stood near the doorway, her body rigid, blanket of rainwater dripping onto the floorboards. Joss busied himself stacking kindling in the stove. When the fire caught, the flicker of orange reached her face, cheeks flushed, lips chapped, eyes too steady for someone who'd just buried her father. "You're shivering," he said. "Get out of those wet clothes. There's a blanket in the chest." She hesitated. "You turn away first." He did, wordless. The fire cracked. The sound of wet fabric being peeled away filled the quiet, a sound that made him suddenly aware of how small the room was. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, almost distant. "My father said this land would eat us if we forgot how to work iron. He believed metal remembers kindness and cruelty." Joss poured 2 tin cups of coffee. He wasn't wrong. He said, "I've seen it cut both ways." She stepped closer to the fire, wrapped in the rough wool blanket, hair let down now, curling at the ends as it dried. The smell of smoke mingled with something faint and wild cedar, or the oil she used on her braids. Outside, wind scraped at the shutters. A coyote yipped far off, answered by another, farther still. Joss sat at the table, sipping his coffee, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind the company, after a time. Nahona sat across from him. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because no one else would." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Or because you're afraid of being like them?" The question hit harder than it should have. Joss looked away, watching the fire instead. "Maybe both," he said at last. They sat in silence after that, each listening to the wind in their own thoughts. The fire hissed softly as a drop of rain leaked through the roof and fell onto the stove. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its edge. "Thank you, Joss Carver." He nodded, still not looking at her. "You're safe here tonight." But long after she'd curled up on the cot and the fire had burned low, Joss stayed awake, hand resting near the revolver on the table. Outside, The land was black and breathing alive with sounds of water and distance. He glanced at Nahona, asleep in the lamplight's dying glow, her face calm but streaked with dried tears. Something inside him, something buried deep under years of dust and silence, shifted slightly, like the earth after a tremor. He didn't know what it meant, or if he wanted to. All he knew was that, for the first time in months, the sound of the rain no longer made him feel alone. By morning, the rain had thinned to mist. The land steamed as the sun rose over the Chiricahuas, turning every puddle into a mirror of blinding light. Joss saddled his horse in silence while Nahona folded the wool blanket with careful precision, a gesture that spoke of habit, not gratitude, when he handed her the reins. She asked, "Where will you take me, Maple Creek?" he said. "Sheriff can help." She didn't argue. Perhaps she knew better than to expect kindness twice in one lifetime. They rode for hours through the soaked valley. The ground squelched beneath the horses' hooves. Mesquite branches hung heavy with rain, and the sky still carried the pale bruise of stormlight. As they neared the town, the smell of smoke and coffee drifted through the air. Civilization, or at least the frontier's idea of it. Maple Creek wasn't much more than a handful of buildings clinging to a muddy street, a saloon with its doors flung open, a general store, a sheriff's office, a church still missing its bell. Children ran barefoot through puddles, and men leaned in doorways, chewing tobacco and watching the newcomers approach. When they saw Nahona, conversation faltered. A man spat into the mud and muttered, "Ain't our kind." Joss's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze forward. He'd seen that look before, fear wrapped in righteousness. Nahona's chin lifted slightly, her shoulders straight. She didn't hide. They tied the horses outside the sheriff's office. Amos Davies, a tall man with graying hair and steady eyes, looked up from his desk when they entered. "Mornin', Carver," he said, voice even. "Heard the storm gave you hell. Found worse than rain," Joss replied. He told the story plainly: the broken wagon, the dead man, the theft. When he finished, the sheriff's pen paused mid-scratch. "Those men sound like the Harlow gang," Davies said, frowning. "Been running trouble from Tucson to Silver City. Mean bastards." Nahona stood silent beside Joss, hands clasped tightly before her. Davies noticed, softened his tone. "Ma'am, I'll send riders north to track 'em. In the meantime, you'll need a place to stay." Joss hesitated. "The boarding house'll turn her away." Davies nodded grimly. "Ain't the first time this town's made that mistake. Cross Creek Ranch might be better. Ephraim and Martha'll see sense." By noon, they were climbing the slope toward Cross Creek, the sun drying mud on their boots. The ranch spread wide across a low ridge, fields of pale grass and a barn built solid against the wind. Ephraim Cross, white-bearded and broad as a wagon, met them at the gate. His wife Martha, round and sharp-eyed, stood just behind him with a towel over one shoulder. When Joss explained, Ephraim didn't hesitate. "No soul gets turned away from this house," he said. "You'll stay as long as you need, miss." Nahona bowed her head slightly. "Thank you." Martha fussed over her, at once ushering her toward the kitchen, muttering about dry clothes and stew on the stove. For the first time, Nahona allowed herself a small, tired smile. That evening, after supper, Joss stood on the porch with Ephraim, watching the last of the storm clouds fade into gold. The older man glanced sideways at him. "World's changing. Boy, folks just take longer to catch up." Joss nodded. "Some don't catch up at all. Below them." Nahona helped Martha gather laundry from the line, her movements deliberate, unhurried. When she looked up, the wind caught her hair, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Joss looked away first, later that night, as the crickets started their song. Nahona stood by the window of the guest room, watching the valley. The smell of stew and soap lingered in her hair. For the first time since the storm, she felt still, yet behind that calm was something unresolved, a question without a name. Outside, Joss lay awake in the bunkhouse, staring at the rafters. He could still see her kneeling by her father's grave, rain washing the mud from her hands. He told himself it was pity that kept her face in his mind, but even he didn't believe that anymore. The days at Cross Creek passed slow and full, the kind that left a man's mind too quiet for his own good. The storm had given way to the long heat of July. Dust hung in the air like a veil, and every board of the porch held the smell of sun and sweat. Joss Carver spent his mornings mending fences along the north pasture and his evenings checking water troughs. Nahona worked alongside Martha Cross, grinding corn, patching clothes, and tending the small garden that struggled against the dry earth. Sometimes, when Joss rode by the house, he would see her kneeling among the bean rows, sleeves rolled, face lifted to the wind as if measuring its change. They spoke little at first. He would nod when she passed with a pail of water. She would answer with a quiet, "Mr. Carver." But the silence between them began to shift, not heavy anymore, but curious, like the moment before a song begins. One afternoon, he found her behind the barn, crouched beside a lame colt. He caught his hoof in wire. She said, "Won't let me close." Joss knelt beside her, keeping his movements slow. "You know horses. My father traded iron for them." She pressed a hand gently to the colt's neck, whispering words in her own tongue. The animal stilled, breath quivering. Joss removed the embedded wire, watching her with quiet astonishment. "You've got the touch," he said. She looked up, the faintest smile in her eyes. "It's not touch, it's trust." After that, they began to talk small things at first. She asked about ranching. He told her about the drought years, the way a man could lose everything to bad luck in one dry season. She told him about the mountains farther east, where the streams still ran clear and wild. One evening, when the heat broke for a moment and a soft wind came down from the hills, Joss sat on the porch cleaning his rifle. Nahona stepped out carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one and leaned against the railing. "My father used to say metal remembers kindness," she said, watching the last of the light spill across the valley. "If you shape it with anger, it breaks. If you shape it with care, it holds." He glanced at her hands, strong, small, stained from work. "And what about people?" She thought for a long time before answering. "People remember everything," she said, "even what they wish they could forget." The words struck deeper than she knew. Joss looked toward the horizon, where the sun was bleeding red behind the hills. "My family's buried near Tucson," he said finally. "Raiders hit our place when I was 16. Some said they were Apache. Maybe they were." She turned to him then, eyes steady. "You still believe that I believed it long enough to hate shadows?" Silence stretched, filled with the hum of crickets. Then she said softly, "Hate is like heat. It burns everything, even what you're trying to protect." He met her gaze, and in that moment, the old wound inside him, the part forged by fear and loneliness, shifted, not healed, but softened. Days passed. They worked together more often. When Joss repaired a broken gate, Nahona held the post steady, when she carried buckets from the well. He took one from her hand without a word. The rhythm of the ranch wrapped them in its quiet spell. But the world outside Cross Creek had not forgotten them. One evening, Sheriff Davies rode in coated with dust. He dismounted heavily, face grave. Got word from Tucson, he told Joss. The Harlow gang's back in the territory. They're asking questions about a woman Apache, young, traveling with a rancher. Sounds a lot like her. Joss's stomach tightened. He glanced toward the house where Nahona stood in the doorway, framed by lamplight. Davies lowered his voice. They think she saw something that could hang them. If they find her, they won't leave it unfinished. Joss nodded slowly. They'll have to ride through me first. That night, he found Nahona outside near the corral, staring at the stars. The wind stirred the loose strands of her hair. You heard he asked? Yes. They'll come, he said. She looked at him then, the firelight from the house flickering in her eyes. Then we'll be ready. The answer surprised him, no fear, only resolve. And for the first time, Joss realized he wasn't protecting someone helpless. He was standing beside someone who had already survived worse than he ever would. When the wind rose again, carrying the scent of distant rain, he felt something change between them. Not a confession, not yet, but the quiet certainty that neither of them would ever be alone again. The heat broke the next night. Clouds rolled over the Chiricahuas again, thick and black, swallowing the moon. A restless wind swept through Cross Creek, stirring dust and unease. Joss Carver lay awake on his bunk, listening to the boards creak, to the cattle shifting nervously in the pen. When the first thunder cracked, he knew it wasn't just the storm that was coming. He dressed quietly, slid his rifle from its rack, and stepped outside. The night smelled of wet sage and danger. Far to the east, a faint glimmer moved too steady for lightning, too alive for stars, lanterns, riders. He crossed the yard and pounded on the main house door. Ephraim Cross opened it, shotgun already in hand. I see him, Joss said. 5, maybe 6. Headed straight for us. Harlow. Has to be. Ephraim's face hardened. Wake the men. I'll get Martha and the girl inside, within minutes. Cross Creek was alive with motion boots thudding, horses snorting, lamps flickering against barn walls. The ranch hands moved like ghosts through shadow, checking rifles, closing gates. Joss took position by the corral fence, heart beating in a rhythm older than fear. Inside, Nahona stood by the kitchen window, shotgun in her arms. Martha Cross fussed around her, lighting lamps, muttering prayers. Stay low, child, the older woman whispered. These walls'll hold. But Nahona's eyes were on the dark hills beyond the fields. She felt it in her bones, the return of something unfinished. The first shot cracked through the night. A sharp flash from the ridge. Splinters flew from the porch post beside Joss's head. The ranch answered in kind. Gunfire echoed off the valley walls. Horses screamed. Thunder joined the chaos. Hold your fire till they're close, Ephraim bellowed. Joss sighted down his rifle and fired once. A rider tumbled from his horse. Another lantern flared, dropped, and the prairie grass caught sudden orange, licking up into the black sky. Smoke rolled thick across the yard. Through it, Joss saw shadows moving fast. They're trying to circle the house, he shouted. He sprinted across the mud, bullets whining past his ears. His boots slipped on wet clay. But he didn't slow. The smell of burning hay hit him. As he reached the barn, the bastards had set it alight. Inside the main house, Nahona heard the fire crackle closer. Martha tried to pull her away from the window, but Nahona shook her head. They'll burn everything, she said. We have to fight. Martha hesitated, then pressed a trembling hand to her cheek. Then fight, girl, but make it count. Outside, Joss reloaded, breath coming hard. He could hear the crackle of flames, the frightened bawl of cattle, then a movement near the back wall of the house, a figure creeping toward the window, the scarred face of Warren Harlow, lit by the burning barn. Not tonight. Joss growled. He threw himself forward, slamming Harlow into the wall. They went down in the mud, fists and elbows flying. Harlow swung a knife. Joss caught the blade on his forearm, felt the burn of steel slice flesh. They grappled, rolled, slammed against the porch steps. "You should have stayed out of it," Cowboy Harlow snarled, pressing the knife to Joss's throat, rain mixed with blood, running cold down his neck. Joss gritted his teeth, forcing the blade back inch by inch. "I don't walk away from graves," he hissed. Harlow laughed a broken, wild sound just as the gunshot came. The outlaw's body jerked, eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, he stayed there, breath catching, then slumped sideways into the mud. Nahona stood in the shattered window behind him, both hands on the shotgun, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was pale, but steady. For a heartbeat, everything stopped, even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Then thunder crashed again, and the night came roaring back. Joss staggered to his feet. "You all right?" he called. She nodded, lowering the gun. "You all live." He pressed a hand to the wound in his arm, the blood dark against his sleeve. By dawn, the gunfire had faded. Two of Harlow's men lay dead in the yard. The others fled into the hills, chased by Sheriff Davies and his posse, who arrived just as the first light broke. The barn smoldered, sending up a thin plume of smoke that rose straight into the morning sky. Joss sat on the porch steps, arm bandaged by Martha's careful hands. Nahona stood beside him, watching the last wisps of smoke drift away. Her hair was loose, tangled with ash and rain, but her eyes were calm. "You saved my life," he said quietly. She looked down at him, expression unreadable. "You buried my father." Neither spoke after that. The sun climbed higher, turning the wet valley gold. The smell of gunpowder lingered, mixed with the clean scent of rain. When Sheriff Davies rode up the path, hat in hand, he surveyed the scene with grim approval. "Looks like Cross Creek stood its ground." "Barely," Joss said. The sheriff dismounted, glanced toward Nahona. "You did good, ma'am, better than most men I know." She gave a small nod, then turned back toward the valley. The storm had passed, but the air still hummed with its memory. Behind them, Ephraim Cross wiped soot from his beard and said, "Reckon this ranch will be talk of the territory come sundown." Joss didn't answer. His gaze followed Nahona's toward the hills where the sun broke through, soft and blinding. He felt the ache in his arm, the weight in his chest, and beneath both, something new, a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight was over, but what it had awakened in him would not fade so easily. The valley was quiet again. Smoke curled lazily from the ruins of the barn, and the wind carried only the faint crackle of dying embers. By noon, the posse had gone, taking the captured outlaws with them. Cross Creek lay battered, but standing a miracle in itself. Joss sat beneath the cottonwood near the well, his arm bound tight in fresh linen. Nahona came toward him, a basin of clean water in her hands. The sunlight glinted off the beads woven into her hair, now dry and tangled, streaked with gray ash. "You should rest," she said, kneeling beside him. "I've had worse." She gave him a look that silenced further bravado, then dipped a cloth into the basin and wiped blood from his temple. Her touch was steady, careful. Joss caught the faint scent of sage and smoke, the scent that seemed to follow her wherever she went. "You could have run," he murmured. "No one would have blamed you." Nahona wrung out the cloth, eyes fixed on the wound. "My father used to say that iron must meet fire before it's worth anything." Maybe that's true for people too. He studied her face, the high cheeks, the faint scar by her jaw, the calm that came not from peace, but from surviving the storm. "You remind me of him," he said softly. She looked up. "Of who, my father?" "He built everything with his hands. Never believed in fear. I lost that for a while." He paused, then added, "You gave it back." They sat in silence, the air warm and still. Down by the creek, the ranch hands cleared debris, their voices distant and low. After a time, Nahona spoke again. "Sheriff Davies says the company from Tucson will return the medal. My father's name will be written in their record, the first Apache they've ever honored in print." Joss nodded. "About damn time." Her smile was small but real. "You'll rebuild?" she asked. "Barn, fences, maybe more." He hesitated, then met her eyes. "You could stay. Cross Creek's too quiet without you." She looked toward the mountains, their ridges shining gold under the sun. "If I stay, it's not because I owe you. I wouldn't ask that." The wind stirred between them, carrying the sweet smell of rain-damp mesquite. She set the cloth aside and took his good hand in both of hers. Her palms were rough, warm. "Then I'll stay," she said. He didn't answer, only closed his fingers around hers, in the hush that followed. The ranch seemed to breathe again, fences waiting to be mended, soil waiting to be turned, life daring to begin where fire had passed. And when she rose, the light caught her hair, turning the ash to silver. Joss watched her walk toward the house, and for the first time in years, he felt certain the land and the heart he'd buried beneath it would grow something worth keeping. A year passed, and Sulphur Springs Valley remembered the storm only through the green that followed it. The land that once cracked and burned now shimmered with tall grass and yellow wildflowers. The people said Cross Creek Ranch had come back from the dead stronger, kinder, different. On a clear morning, Joss Carver stood at the edge of the field, his sleeves rolled, his hat pushed back, watching the new barn catch the first light. Beside him, Nahona walked slowly, one hand resting over the small swell beneath her dress. Her turquoise necklace glowed against her skin like a living flame. "Fence'll hold through winter," Joss said, squinting toward the ridge. She smiled faintly. "So will we." They rode out together to the lone cottonwood by Dry Creek, where a small mound of stones marked her father's grave. Joss carried something wrapped in canvas, the piece of broken iron they had used as a marker. He placed it gently atop the stones. "It's been reforged," he told her. "The same metal, shaped new." Nahona brushed her fingers across the cool surface, whispering words in Apache, the rhythm low and steady as breath. The wind rose, carrying her prayer across the valley. When she looked up, Joss took her hand. "You said fire makes the metal strong," he said. "Guess it works on people, too." Her lips curved in a quiet smile. "Then we're forged, you and I." They stood there as the wind shifted, warm and full of summer. Below them, the creek sparkled with the memory of rain. The valley that had once been carved by hate now lay open, gentle, alive. As they turned back toward the ranch, toward the life they had built with sweat, loss, and love, a thin line of cloud drifted across the sun, silver-edged, promising rain. And in that light, It seemed the earth itself was forgiving. If this story moved you, remember out here, beneath the endless western sky, every storm leaves behind something worth keeping. On this channel, we bring you tales of courage, love, and redemption from the Wild West, stories of hearts forged like steel, tested by dust, fire, and rain. If you felt the strength of Joss Carver and Nahona, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because every day we ride back into that wide frontier to remind you, even in the harshest land, compassion still has a home and love still finds its way.